All right. Well, thank you all for joining us this evening. This is the session to go over using your platform for positive change. Our guest speakers for tonight are Joetta Wright and Toussaint Morrison. So they are the co-hosts of a podcast called Double Consciousness. And keeping in mind the times that we're currently in right now, we figured, MinWIFT figured it would be a great opportunity to have the important conversations we need to be having and knowing what we can do as a community to help foster that, or at least help be a voice and foster that change. So for starters, I'd like to have the speakers introduce themselves. So Joetta, I'll start off with you.
Hi there, my name is Joetta Wright. I'm an actor, singer, voiceover talent, and co-host of the podcast Double Consciousness here in the Twin Cities.
Hey, I'm Toussaint Morrison. I am I guess, second in command at Double Consciousness. I just kind of follow Joetta's lead and, see where the conversation goes. And actor, voiceover artist, and musician and filmmaker. So yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. So to get into conversations here, I want to talk a little bit about your podcast and what that is. Can you guys explain to us what Double Consciousness is?
Absolutely. So Double Consciousness is based on the theory of double consciousness by W.E.B. Du Bois, who stated that Black Americans have two types of consciousness, one as an American and one as a Black American, where we understand very well that there are rules and regulations that affect us that don't affect our white peers. And so we learn through experience how to maneuver in a world in which we are seeing the system of oppression work very, very well, while our white counterparts, because of their white lens, aren't able to see the trials and tribulations and that system working the way it was designed to work. And we look at all of that through the lens of politics, through pop culture, through our shared experiences and our personal experiences growing up here in Minnesota, the racism we've encountered here growing up, and how we see all of that playing into the global perspective as well.
And Toussaint, anything you want to add to that?
I mean, it essentially, it started off like when I came to Joetta to see if she wanted to do the podcast, it was just, I'd like to create a space where we can talk about really anything Black. And what it really kind of turned into is just us being our authentic selves, like whether it's about Blackness or not, or whatever it is, or about, talking about Netflix. Because I just didn't know of any spaces where you could do that, especially on set, like as a person of color. Usually it's like you whispering to another person of color, like, look at that guy over there. Mm-hmm. How did you get booked for this? How did the director talk to you? There's no spaces to really talk to other Black creatives or creatives of color about that. And so creating Double Consciousness, or it wasn't Double Consciousness when I came to Joetta. I was just like, hey, do you want to just do a podcast and talk? And then when she mentioned the phrase double consciousness, that's when I think it kind of elevated to a more specific direction. And that's my experience with the origin of this.
Yeah. And how long have both of you been doing this for?
Dude, I think it's been 2.5 years now.
Yeah, 2.5 years.
Yeah.
Started off in my mother's basement. Had a situation where I had to kind of retreat back to my mom's house. And so I had these microphones, these that I had put together, and I was like, do you want to do this podcast in my mom's basement? We started there, and then I've now graduated to having an apartment, and so now we're here 2.5 years later, and we're still kicking. We're waiting on our 100th episode. 100th episode is coming up.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
And so beyond starting then, what was that push that made you guys officially go into creating this podcast, knowing that this was something that needed to be heard and spoken about 2 years ago?
I think it was the lack of support I know that I felt in seemingly my own community. And knowing that me and Toussaint have been working together for years already, and that we had been having these conversations about our shared community, white, Black, everybody. And then also knowing that within the Black artistic community, we're having to support each other in different ways, you know? And so after coming together and really thinking about, okay, we are not getting what we need from our own community. What can we do to support each other? And so I think this grew out of a need for us to lift each other up when we knew no one else was going to do it for us. And I'm glad we did.
Yeah.
Because people are listening. We're getting a lot of specifically white listeners who are writing in, who are thanking us for having these difficult conversations, who are saying, well, this is something I never thought of, and you guys are making me think that just because I see myself as a white progressive person doesn't mean that I'm not still operating within the system that has created my white progressiveness, which we love being able to hear and being a part of that shift in our white accomplices. And so it's been an interesting journey seeing our growth, our personal growth, seeing the people grow around us, including our family members, our friends who are seeing a different side of us and our artistic voices, and then also being able to affect some sort of change in our local and national and actually global community, because people are listening from all over the world. I forget that. Yeah.
And so you talked a little bit about your audience, starting off with wanting to do something for the Black community and Black artists. And then now that is gradually shifting and expanding not only globally, but also to some potential white allies. Would you say that your target demographic has changed from inception? Or are there more details that you have about who your messages are for?
It's funny. I don't know if you agree with this, Toussaint, but I've seen a shift in the extreme diversity of the amount of people who are listening. All sorts of different people now. And I think we're hearing a lot of resonance, especially from our Black and brown Minnesotans, fellow Minnesotans, who have been feeling isolated in this space and who haven't necessarily found the language to classify the like soft Minnesota type of racism that we experience here, compared to if we were to be in another part of the United States, while people are experiencing racism through a different lens. And I think that's more empowering for people to be able to hear us talk about what we know to be, but is somewhat difficult to be able to actually articulate when it's happening in the moment, and also when you're young, and then also maybe when you've like had years and years and years, a lifetime of these experiences, but you know, they just end up being like part of your daily routine. What do you think, Toussaint?
Well, I think I didn't even know who the audience was going to be, like to speak to that off the bat. I just wanted to have a place to talk, and then I think create, develop some type of confidence to speak. Because if Joetta can speak to this, like my main worry in the beginning was like, oh my God, nobody's ever going to hire me again. Like no white person's ever going to want to talk to me, you know, because, you know, we're here talking the way we would talk amongst, you know, other people of color. And my main fear, which is very selfish, was, you know, oh, I'm going to lose my job. But I think and my inspiration was a podcast called The Read with Kid Fury and Crystal. And they gave me like full permission to be as authentic as possible within your Black experience. Whereas sometimes on a film set, you are totally depermissioned to be your full self. And I think, you know, a lot of female bodies can speak to this on film sets as well. It's like you're depermissioned to be your authentic self, where you have to walk very carefully for fear of physical, mental, or spiritual danger. And so creating a space where you could just talk about all that stuff. You talk about, you know, male privilege, white privilege, cisgender privilege, straight privilege, and speak to that I didn't know what kind of audience was going to turn up, but I mean, there's like old black men from like Alabama to like young white women in Iowa. So I couldn't tell you, and I really had no strategy of what we were going to take on, but it's been really encouraging to see the people that have turned out.
Yeah. And that's interesting that you say that, because again, one of the things that you mentioned is starting this podcast, you felt like no one would ever want to hire you. And I feel like that's a real fear for especially Black artists who speak out. So Effie Brown talking against Matt Damon when he said, we don't care about the folks who are behind the camera telling the stories. We want the people who are in front of the camera is where the diversity stands. Mm-hmm. Or even with, recently John Boyega standing up for Black Lives Matter and, fearing that he may not be ever hired again, but then having the community rally around them.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts around, I guess, just that fear, and how do you get over, obviously you've been having this podcast, you create episodes, and this is maybe a two-part question here. How do you get past that fear of voicing your opinion?
Do you want to take it first, Joetta?
No, you go ahead.
I think for me, because I had started, all of this started around the same time I started a YouTube channel called Urban Home Cinema. And Double Consciousness was part of an effort that was basically putting as much money as I could where my mouth was. And so I am creating films, podcasts, and music that employ as many people of color as possible and tell stories of color. So that's all that it is. And when I started Urban Home Cinema, the idea was to create a space where, hey, I can make my own work. Hey, I can direct things and I'm Black. Hey, I can write scripts and I'm Black. I can make films and I'm Black. And once I was able to do that and then do Double Consciousness, the fear kind of went away, because there were a few white DPs and directors on set that would say, wow, that thing that you were in on YouTube was real funny, man. Who's doing that? And I would tell them, me, I made that. And they're like, what? Because the disbelief that a person of color in their 30s could create a quality TV show on YouTube, to them was unbelievable. And it shows you just the inherent racism, or the way that they've devalued Black bodies in their mind, that they think, oh, wow, these Black folks can make film too? Oh my goodness. And when people comment on the podcast, they're like, wow, it's a really quality podcast. And so when you start hearing from people that, wow, your stuff is pretty quality, the confidence or the fear of losing a job goes away, because you're starting to see that you can create your own work. Like I don't need to go to audition at Best Buy and get told like some really racist stuff and then feel like, oh my God, do I got to come back to this director again? It's so weird. If I can create my own platform, or at least sneak in my own platform and start creating from there and growing, then that fear goes away, because when you get to the point where you can turn down a job because it feels dangerous or harmful to your body, that's when the fear goes away. And it sucks that it sometimes has to come to that point for us to feel that, for us to lose that fear. So, yeah.
How about you, Joetta?
I think fear started fading away after our first episode. Oh. And I heard what it could be. And not only for our audience, but really for me, which was sort of like a therapeutic experience first and foremost, because I was able to give voice to all of these thoughts that were in my head, all of these experiences that I knew that I had and that I knew were extremely universal, but really difficult for people to stand up and stand out in their truth and actually say. And I would also say that just like the older I get, the more research I do, the more I educate myself about my history, about our shared history in this world in Minnesota, and about my Blackness, I am realizing that there isn't a lot of choice now. I do have to really stand up and be that voice for myself, because as you learn about what's happened to like our people, it's been really, really challenging for me to just walk through the world and have these experiences, have people in positions of power in our community say like racist or harmful things, and have to move forward and still work with those people. And so I think being able to stand in my truth about what I know to be this very, very intentionally functioning system, and how people can operate within it without even really understanding the damage that they do. The more I started to put the pieces of the puzzle together for myself, the more I was able to stand firm in my truth.
Mm-hmm. Great. So before I get to the systemic question, I did want to ask first about, how do you go crafting your episodes for each of the podcast sessions?
Well, we have a nice little system. We start each episode with a song. So one of us, we rotate, and one of us will come in with the song because we're both musical people, and the other person will try to guess the song. And then that usually prompts a little discussion, and then we separate the podcast into sort of sections. The first section is called Black Love, and we really talk about people who are making a difference, making change in the Black community, or maybe a white accomplice who's really, really standing up for their Black brothers and sisters. And then we, what's the next section, Toussaint?
There's Black Love, and then it's New Hotness.
New Hotness.
Which is, please do not hold Joetta accountable for that. I came up with that. And then at the end is Double Consciousness Moment, and then Done Differently.
Yeah. So in our double consciousness moments, we talk about a moment that week where we have encountered racism, what we did, what we wish we had done, and sort of how it's left us feeling and what we're processing about it. And then Done Differently is what we wish we would have done differently for the week. And a lot of times it's connected to, it's really funny because for both of us, a lot of these instances happen just for some reason happen to either be like at an audition or at the gym. And that's just how it goes for the both of us. Like for some reason, that's just happening. When Toussaint's in the steam room or when I'm in the steam room, people for some reason just let stuff loose. And it's funny that we're like figuratively and like literally, but it's funny to see where people feel like unabashedly brave and brazen in their racism.
Yeah, it gets awkward because, even for myself, and I find myself in these situations, most of the time I try to, just move past it. And then it's not until I get home, I'm like, wait a minute, what did they mean by that? So
hold on here.
Wait, I get it. Okay. And then often I also find myself talking about moments that I'm not proud of, where I wish I would have said something. I wish I would have stood my ground, where I wish I would have been bold enough to say something when I knew it was wrong in the moment. And I think that's something that I have to continue owning and have to continue saying, because I hold myself accountable for growing and changing and learning from those moments. And with every one of those stories, every one of those times where I wanted to have said something, I think I am starting to realize that there's power in community with owning that, and knowing that we're not perfect and that we're working to try to do better every day,
And I think, Alison, you bring up a good point. It's like you said I try my best to work through it, and then you get home and you're like, hey, which brings up a great point. It's do we ever really get through it? Like ever, even if we call somebody out, like on set or at work or in conversation, we still carry the trauma. Just last night, I was hanging out with a bunch of white folks, and we were all having wine, and it was a great time. And then somebody decided to start talking about colonialism. Now, everybody turns to me, 10 minutes in the conversation, and the burden is on us, to carry their white fragility with comfort, and like really make them feel at home. And it's I think double consciousness is also just a white flag, no pun intended, and just like, I'm done with making white folks feel comfortable. I'm actually done.
Yeah.
It's not like I don't care or I'm apathetic to it. It's, I'm not going to play the role of, you know, Black therapist to white folks or Black history teacher to white folks. And so it really became, yeah, I'm kind of done. And that it brings up the question, I think, which is really powerful that you said, Alison, you know, do we ever really get through it? You know, so I don't know. I don't really have an answer to that one.
I got to piggyback off of that with a story of my own.
Okay.
Last month, in May, I was in a voiceover workshop, and it was hosted by people that I knew. And unfortunately, we came to a point where I was getting, feedback, because we came there with like a couple of different reads of stuff that we wanted to work on. And we were prompted with a couple of questions, you know, one of which is, who are you talking to? Like, who are you trying to reach with this voiceover? And so it comes to me and I'm thinking, well, who am I trying to talk to? And I have the person in my head, right? And I'm thinking of one of my friends. And then one of the people who's hosting this workshop said, okay, Joetta, who are you talking to? And I said, okay, I got the person in my head. And he's like, okay, so it's your friend, Shalisa. And then everyone moved on. And I was like, hold the phone.
Yeah.
And I said, excuse me, who's Shalisa? And why is she my friend?
Oh, my God.
I think my exact words were, who the hell is Shalisa? And then everybody skated past it and moved on. And then I doubled back when he was finished speaking and I said, hold on, who is Shalisa? And to me, I think that is it captures those moments where people don't understand the harm that they're doing. And if they do continue to do it and perpetrate the crime and allow the system to do its work, that is the system that we're all living in and not flourishing in. And so it was frustrating to me then to have to sit in this moment in a workshop that I'm paying for with people who I know and have to move on in a 2-hour workshop by myself without backing and know that I'm the odd one out in my community, which is constantly happening. Little things like that, constantly.
And that begs the question too, right? Because you in that moment were able to say something about it, and the hope, at least, and one thing I do want to focus on too for this conversation here is, you know, what can we as a community do better? Because the hope would have been someone else as part of that workshop would say, hey, dude, this is not cool. And it shouldn't be the onus, and in my opinion, the onus shouldn't be left on Black people to educate everybody of the suffering that is going on, because you can turn on the TV and see the issues, and if you really want to find out, there is a plethora of where you can find that from. But when it comes to community, and one of the things that I would love to hear you guys' input on as well is, what can our white allies, accomplices do, especially when they see a situation like that, rather than just sit down and not say anything? What are some things that you want to see the community do better?
That's a long list.
I would say have the conversation with their white counterparts. That's the start, right? Because the only thing I can kind of compare it to is, so the past 16 years, I've worked in ending sexual assault workshops across the country. And the problem is that when you have these conversations, you have a lot of men and women in the room. And what a lot of the men in the audience do is they look to the women to what can I do? How should I act? When it then puts the burden on female bodies to tell men what to do, when really the number one perpetrators by and large perpetrators of sexual assault are men. By and large perpetrators of white supremacy are white folks. So it should be the people that made the mess to fix the mess. So it should be you and your constituents discussing amongst you and your constituents. How can we hold each other accountable? How can we check each other on our language when we tacitly are complicit with white supremacy? Like, when are we putting that in? And a lot of people are very surprised. Oh, wow, how is Minnesota the hotbed of all this racial unrest? Well, I was born in New Orleans, and the reason why we're able to, I mean, there's not like nothing like George Floyd happens in Louisiana because that discussion's already there. If somebody's racist in Louisiana, they'll tell you why, where, and when they began to be racist, and they'll justify it. But they'll be open to a conversation. However, in Minnesota, it's so psychologically and debilitating, because as Black people, we're just entirely gaslit all the time, because we're being told this state is liberal, we're being told this state is Democrat, we're being told these are all nonprofits, we're being told that, hey, this is a safe space, we're being told all are welcome here, when really it couldn't be further from the truth. You're not welcome here. I'm going to look at you sideways. I'm going to ask you if you're going to buy something here, before I really trust you. And I'm going to justify all of my covert white supremacy with the fact that I'm a Democrat, or the fact that I voted for Hillary, or the fact that I don't like Trump. And you don't need to be, you need to vote for Trump to be racist. You just need to be white. And I think the number one need when we talk about what white folks can do is have the conversation amongst themselves and hold themselves accountable, and really navigate what that looks and feels like. And at first, just like anti-sexual assault workshops, it's messy. Like, dudes, we say dumb things and we end up offending people and we end up like ruining it, but that's part of it. And for white folks, it's gonna get messy. You're gonna get embarrassed and this is that and the third, but the good news is the cops ain't gonna shoot you. Worst thing is that you're gonna feel a little uncomfortable, but you learn to like navigate that, like figure out what that space is. And you can start at any age. It's like reading. You can learn to do it at any age. And so once you start it, then you really begin to explore that dialogue and narrative amongst your own white constituents, which I think is really powerful.
Oh my gosh. I think I would have to absolutely agree with that, Alison. And I feel like one of the things is like, you can't be afraid to look stupid, like you were saying, Toussaint. And I think as we get older, there's this very strange belief that we're not supposed to learn like we did as children. When we're forming our thoughts and our understanding of the world and the way that it functions, it was messy. And we've all happened to blossom into the fantastic people that we are now, but we cannot say that we know everything, that we've been educated enough, and that our job is done. And so know that for the white body, if you're not spending your life, if you're not getting a doctorate in like understanding race, there's going to be a huge learning curve right now. Yeah. And you're not going to know a lot. And that's okay. And unfortunately, that means that the system is working, has been working very, very well as it was intended to. Because when we're seeing these phrases like white fragility come out, and people are talking about like white tears and people not being able to hold these conversations, in that we're asking white people to flex their muscles right now. Like in this learning curve, it's about building your stamina as a white person, because we as Black people have been taking hits, building our stamina, taking hits, moving forward for our entire lives. And as it comes right now, as we're seeing things unfold right now, white people are not in the same space. And so I think that right now it's important for white people to remember that it is about education, it is about humility, it is about being brave enough to ask questions. And what was the other thing I was gonna say? Not looking stupid. Okay, and then the other thing, y'all, we have to talk about one of the most important things, one of the things that no one wants to do, and it's sharing power. We have been built. We have lived in such a way in the United States, especially, where we feel like power is king, and that even in an artistic community that boasts itself to be beyond race and universal, like, we see serious power structures in play. And when I'm talking about power structures, I'm talking about everything that I've learned from when I was a child. I grew up here in Minnesota. I worked at the Children's Theater. I went to Perpich Center for Arts Education. I went to a conservatory program in Seattle, which is pretty much the same thing, Cornish College of the Arts. And through all of that, I knew, even when I was a child on the stage at the Children's Theater, that I was there as a Black body when the white artistic director, the white director, the white producer, the white writer wanted me to be. When I was telling their version of my story, when I was speaking through their lens, when it was appropriate, when it was considered appropriate for them, when they wanted to hear me, not when I wanted to speak. And I knew that as a young kid. And I'm a mentor to a now 15-year-old girl who was 12 at the time, but she was, I'm pretty sure, the first Black Mary Poppins in Mary Poppins Jr. In all of Minnesota. And she told me while I was helping her in her audition process, when we were singing her songs and I was giving her her choreography, she looked at me and she was like, "Joetta, I don't know if they're ready for a Black Mary Poppins." Because at 12 years old, she knew what she was up against. Mm-hmm. And when we look at power, people, we have to look at who is making, in terms of theater, like, who's making the lineup for our season. In terms of film, who's saying what stories need to be told. In terms of organizations, we're talking about who's saying who's going to be here for this talk. You know, we have to sit back and think, how can we share our power? How can we, as white people and with white women, how can we share our power with people of color, with women of color? Because so often I see a lot of white women thinking because they're women, they understand how to tell any sort of story. And it's so important that you're remembering that you have to, in order for something to be successful, in order for it to register deep down in the human soul, in the human psyche, which is why we do what we do, you have to make sure that there are people at the table who have equal power to you, no matter what. And that's very community-based. That's a very community-based understanding that I have, because I grew up understanding that ensemble work was the way to go and the only way to be and the only way to create art. And we can't just say that we're seeing white men perpetuating this cycle, because I'm reading Women, Race, and Class right now by Angela Davis. And she puts it extremely just so succinctly and perfectly. You know, when at the turn of the century, like, when I know white women were struggling to find their voice and their power, when they were looking for their ability to vote, when they were fighting for themselves, you know, it was a struggle. It was so hard to remember, like, we have Black sisters who are in bondage. But when we're in a survival state, at that time, people were thinking like, I'm just getting out of bondage. White women were just getting out of bondage, so I need to save myself, you know? And I think there's so much of this mentality and there's so much of this history that if we don't know it, you don't understand that all of that is circulating still through like all of our DNA, you know? And I mean, not statistically speaking, but there's serious research talking about the fact that like all of our ancestors' trauma is all up in our DNA right this second. And I know it's in mine. So we have to really sit with our history and what we've been taught from that, because for some reason people just don't want to learn from what we've been doing for years, and the lessons that should be right in front of our face that we could learn from if we took those lessons and actually were brave enough to step forward and say, you know what? I knew we were doing what we knew how to do at this point, but we know better now. And so we can do better.
You had some good solid points in here that I really wanted to call out. One of them being, you can't be afraid to look stupid, because that's one thing that, I've heard from, white counterparts. If something were to come up, it's like, well, I don't want to have to say the wrong thing. And the question is, but who are you afraid of offending? Because technically, if you're standing up for somebody, that's not a bad thing, and don't look at it as a bad thing, and don't feel like you just have to wash your hands because, well, you don't want to cause any trouble. And I'll probably mess up this quote, but then something along the lines of well-behaved women seldom make history. So those are one of those instances where if you see something, you say something. And then the other bit too was about sharing that power. And that's a lot of what we see happening right now, where for a long time, it was white males telling stories for everyone, not only Black people included, but then white women, how they wanted to be seen and portrayed. And again, a lot has now disseminated to what we're experiencing now, not only as a nation, but culturally. So now we've come to the point where I guess it's at a head, where we are now able to start having that opportunity to speak our own power. But at the same time, it's super important that we get those allies with us and helping us along the way, and not feeling like, well, I'm in my own struggle and therefore I do not see yours, but more of, if we're all in this together, then that really does push everyone forward, each generation forward. Mm-hmm. So I did want to open up to questions here, because I've seen some really good questions come through, and wanted to make sure we got to those before we ran out of time. So, I can work backwards here from the list. So one of the ones I came in was, what's the intersection of women's rights and the Black Lives Matter movement? And I believe maybe Kelly submitted that question, but Kelly, do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, hi. Thank you guys both for doing this. I'm a podcast junkie and I just subscribed to your podcast, so yay.
Thanks, Kelly.
I'm on the board, and I've got two parts of that question. I have a community of women called Athena Village online, and it's interesting. I had a conversation with Dawn, who is actually on this call today, and she made me realize that while when I set up my community, equity was one of my core values. And as we were talking, I was like, that needs to be split. Anti-racism and women's equality, women's rights are not all the same. In my mind, when I set this up before, it was kind of all one big, equal rights for everyone. But this summer, my eyes have been opened, let's just say. And so today I split that into two different categories. Anti-racism is one, and I've taken a pledge and I'm doing all sorts of stuff. And then there's equal rights for women. I'm 62 years old. I've been watching this fight for the ERA for 50 some years. And I came across Gloria Steinem's article that was titled After Black Power, Women's Liberation in 1969. So that's 51 years ago, guys. So I'm really curious. And then the WIFT is creating our own online community. And we need to have these difficult conversations where we can get uncomfortable, but in safe spaces where we can then be, we can find out why we're uncomfortable, and we can be told this, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. What is the intersection between, damn it, we got to get that frickin' ERA passed, because the only one right that women have, according to our Constitution, that is inalienable is voting, which, by the way, we took by force. We weren't given that right. And it was all women in 1920, Black women included. Not that you were allowed to vote, your ancestors, but we did all get it at the same time. We still don't have other rights. So where's the intersection of the Black Lives Matter and the women? How can we come together and fight for all of these things together? This is a way bigger conversation than tonight, but I'm just curious about
it can be. For me, the intersection happens, and I could be off, and this is I think the intersection for me, in my experience, and I could be off, is that the obvious answer, Black females. But so that involves, right, that involves male bodies or non-female bodies having to listen, and that involves white bodies having to listen. And I think what we get lost in the intersection, or the intersection gets lost, is where we can be talking about race and then enter white woman with said white woman tears, and then story that then makes it about them. Unbeknownst to them, that now the conversation about race has been muted. And now it's about, now the white women entering the foray might think that, well, hey, I've steered this conversation to be about feminism, misogyny, rape culture, whatever have you. But it's not, it's about specifically white women and how they feel. So I find the intersection to be with Black females. And that's why across the board, like when you look at the struggle of the infant mortality rate for Black females, the stark life expectancy contrast for Black females, the way they're treated in the medical field, the way they're treated in any field, that for me, that's the intersection. Joetta, am I hitting that or?
No, I hear you on that. And I think at the intersection of all of that has to definitely be the word privilege, because we have to understand in every body where our privilege lies. I know for me, I was educated in Breck private school. I lived in Maple Grove, Minnesota. I was like one of a couple of Black people, and there was a very serious understanding of what articulation sounded like and what I was supposed to sound like as a Black person. And I think there is privilege in my life through the lens of education and what that has done to me and the privileges that it has afforded me, because that has been where the white person believes there is power and privilege in our world. And so I know in my Black skin, that is where I hold a lot of privilege that I have to dissect in my life, because it's not the same. It's not the same story for some of my Black people. And I think then my white sisters have to look at their skin and say, I know I have been broken. I know I have been bruised. I know I have been fighting for my rights. But what is that? What has my white skin afforded me that it has not afforded my Black sister? And then we have to think, okay, so what can the white sister do for her Black sister so that we can come together? Because that was the whole purpose at the beginning, was for us to rise up together as women to become the powerhouse that we knew we were going to be and take over the damn world. That's what we were supposed to do. And then comes in this understanding that we are supposed to be separate. And in order to survive, what are we going to do to rise above so that we can align ourselves with our white men? Because that is how we know how to survive. And I think in order for all of those things to live in the same space, we have to look at each other as women and say, I love you. I forgive you for what we could have done. And I want to walk with you forward to do something more powerful than what my ancestors put in place in the first place. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Yes, very much so. And I'm hopeful that a little teeny part is creating spaces, both MinWift and what I'm doing in my business, for that to happen. That's
Absolutely.
my small part. So come on
and
in.
the small
Thank
part
you for
that
being
we
here.
do equal all of the movements that we have seen make any sort of difference in the world.
Right.
And when I hear you say small part, it reminds me of that, because there is no whole without like the individual and the people to move it
Well,
with.
and I heard a statistic, and anybody who knows if this is real or not, but 45% of our workforce are gig employees, like many of us. I'm a solopreneur. And if one of the parts of the pledge that I took asked us to look at every single vendor that we are using, and granted, I don't spend $1 million a year in my business, but I did find out that the scheduler that I wanted to use was created by a Black man. And so I made, all right, there you go. I'm going to use that one instead of Acuity or whatever. So little teeny decisions that all 45% of this workforce, that's a lot of people, you guys.
Absolutely.
I mean, and we get discounted a lot. So you're right. That's how
And
the
the
Grand
good part-
Canyon was built, right?
And the good part is always working with intention, right? So knowing what
Yes.
can we do to be better, but at the same time, and when you talk about intersectionality, not diminishing someone else's, pain or trauma to then replace it with your own, because we get that everybody and every single race, gender is going through something, but then making sure that everyone has their voice. And if, the focus right now is on race, then let's make sure that that gets coddled as much as anything else would be. So I'll move on to the next question here. I know we're almost at time, but this one came in from Sandra. So she asked, what happens, and this was earlier in the conversation, but what happens on a film set where they can't be authentic? And what is their experience, and what can others do to make the environment more safe for everyone? But Sandra, did you want to expand on your question?
I do a lot of independent filmmaking. Toussaint, you're very familiar to me. And you had mentioned earlier, being on a set, things made you feel unsafe. So I'm just wondering, what was that? And what could I do as a director, producer to make sure that doesn't happen, or that I'm aware of it and can take action?
So like on sets, I remember there's one set, there was like a shotgun being used in a set, and a bunch of cops are breaking into an apartment, and then they got a shotgun. Before we do the scene or the shotgun enters the set, you have a safety meeting, right? And you say, okay, this is the shotgun. It's going to shoot blanks, or it's not going to shoot blanks. We're going to point it downwards. This is the action of it, the choreography of it, just so people know and understand and that they're safe. This is going to kill me because I forget their names. I did a play at the Guthrie. Last one I'll do because I kind of refuse to go back into that building because it's not a safe space. But I think it was called Second Act. The play was put on by a theater group called Second Act, and it's majority women above 45 or 50 creating plays. And before, we start rehearsal, they kind of give out the same thing as a safety meeting, but this is what we're going to talk about with sexual assault and misogyny, and we're not going to have it on set. And if you feel unsafe, you're going to talk to this person. We have a person on set that you can talk to and speak to about this. We have a liaison, or somebody you can call, and that was there. That was set in place. Like if there's sexual harassment or somebody felt, anybody felt uncomfortable, or if they were in a dangerous spot, and it let everybody kind of like, at least, for me and my male privilege, I don't have to worry about that as much as female bodies do, just because of patriarchy. But I thought it was a great move that nobody really does. To answer your question, I think a safety meeting, including racism, addressing white supremacy and patriarchy on a set would be a great first move. To say, if you feel uncomfortable with the way that anybody is speaking in regards to race, joking about it, maybe inserting their white body into your space, you know, when you really don't, you know, you don't feel that it needs to be there. You know, there's a lot of times we'll be on set as people of color, and there's always one white extra or somebody that's, you know, a principal, and they just kind of like lean in and they just say some weird stuff. And it's just like, I'm trying to do my job here as best I can. I don't want to hear your story about, you know, your black uncle, or like, it just gets weird. Like, you know, and if you were able to make a safety meeting in the beginning to say, hey, we're not going to stand for sexual harassment. We're not going to stand for white people troweling out derogatory language. And that's just the way this is going to go. Everybody got it? Here's a liaison on set if you want to talk to them about it. And they are a neutral being. And then I think that's a place to start, I think.
Nice. I've seen a lot of that at Huge Theater before. Every class, every show, I don't know if either of you work at Huge Theater. Can I follow up with one more question, Alison?
Sure.
So I was just asked to direct a stage play called Doubt. It was set in the 60s.
Oh.
And,
Nice.
it has a priest, 2 nuns, and a mother of the only African-American student in.
Yeah.
And I've been trying to figure out how to appropriately say that I need a person of color. And the other caveat on top of that is it's in this small town in Wisconsin. So I talked to Jill at Huge, and she said, you know, Sandy, I am not going to recommend anyone unless I know it's a safe space. And that's probably not a safe space. So what should I do in a situation like that, or a director in a situation like that?
I mean, in that instance, in your casting call, you have to say that this is the character. In the play Doubt, that is an integral part of the story. She has to be a Black woman for the story to make sense, for her role to make sense in the character that she has to develop, being in the position that that woman is in as a Black woman who wants the best for her son, but only has like a certain amount to be able to like allow, or there's so much going on with that role, but like that's a Black woman's role.
It is.
So you just have to say it.
Yeah.
No one auditions. No one can.
And I'll follow up on that too, because especially for roles that involve Black people, and then there is some form of trauma around it. And I think Ava DuVernay did this on the set of When They See Us. She had a counselor on set, because if they go through a scene where, you know, they've put out all this emotion, and for some people it really is traumatic because they could experience it. They want to know that there is that opportunity, or that person, like Toussaint had mentioned, that they can go to and say, hey, we're just going to have a therapeutic session here just to talk through things. And it doesn't necessarily need to be a problem, but then just a means to be able to communicate. All right, so I want to do one more question here before we run all the way out of time, because I really like this one. But it came in from Sierra, and her question was, how can we help build the next generation of BIPOC in film, particularly in the cities? To those classes. But Sierra, did you want to expand on your question?
Yeah, I'll make it really quick. I think that obviously we know that there are people who are interested in the arts and there's amazing stories to be told, but also to create space behind the camera as well, because that's where those power positions are built. And really, like you said too, Joetta, creating the space for that as well. And even that just starts with getting people in the door as PAs. So how do we get people interested? How do they feel safe? Is that maybe finding some people who are already working in the community, who are directors, are DP, are, you know, producers, and maybe are they teaching classes? Would that be a great opportunity? If they did, how do you specifically target? I mean, this is a huge question, but like creating even like reduced tuition, and specifically scouting out just Black bodies saying, hey, you can actually make a living in a career carrying sandbags if you wanted to, or build your way up to say, hey, maybe I actually want to do this type of work instead, but I have my foot in the door specifically in this community.
Well, to answer your question, I'm actually doing a video about this next week, because
Cool.
I worked with Twin Cities PBS for about 2.5 years, and the entire experience was good and bad, but the bad far outweighed the good. And I think the first step is to not operate under the delusion as a white person that you're doing any favor for people of color. And when I say that, I mean that there's a lot of white writers, white directors, white filmmakers at TPT PBS that think they're doing us a service, when really they're doing us the greatest disservice, where they're putting our faces of color out in front, and then they're writing the words for us, they're controlling the narrative, it's almost a very grotesque way of policing Black narrative. It's not even almost, it just is. But my answer to your question is, and I'm going to take a swag at this, I don't know if this is going to work. I left TPT PBS because they didn't say anything about George Floyd for a week. And they didn't say anything about George Floyd until I made a video saying, hey, you didn't say anything about George Floyd. So they then said something, but they didn't even really say something after that. So for me, when we talk about film, I think film is community to me. And it's one of the first communities I felt a part of. In music, community is far and few in between, but in film, there's a community that holds people accountable. If you sexually harass somebody on set, everybody feels it. It ruins the entire energy. If you say something racist or derogatory, it hurts somebody. You can feel it communally, like on a set. And so to cut that off and to stop that and to get BIPOC people in positions of power where they're on the other side of the camera, you're gonna have to give them the camera. You just gotta give it to them. And then also, but that's gotta happen in a way, which the swag I'm taking next week is, I'm taking my face out of my media thing, and I'm going to start filming any person of color that just wants to jump in. And that's my offer. And I think Max Schoberg, who's white, is going to start helping people of color operate these very simple cameras. And then the goal is to then give the camera to them. And it's, if you teach somebody to fish, they'll be able to eat for a lifetime. So I think it starts with opening up the doors voraciously. Not just, hey, come on down to MCAD, we got a scholarship for you. You're still entering a white space. It's still dangerous. Yeah. I think you have to create a new space. And white people, as Joetta said, have to share the power willingly, for free. And you're just gonna have to take the hit. Just donate some time and energy. Just get it out there. So I think it starts there. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
No problem.
And wait, go ahead, Joetta. Go ahead.
I'll just say that I believe that white people have to stop perpetuating the myth that they're doing something if they're not. And I say that meaning that if you say that, you put out a casting call, but no Black or brown people showed up, what does that mean about where you have placed the information for people to see? And who are you talking to? If all of the people around you are white and your base is white, how do you expect for that space to be, number one, welcoming, and secondly, for any brown people to show up? Because you haven't really invited them. You just opened the doors and didn't do anything. Where are you going with this information? Who are you sending it to? I worked at North High School as the theater teacher several years ago. There are plenty of young Black artists there who want to do internships. What are we doing to reach out to different neighborhoods of color? Do you know where the Black and brown businesses are? Do you know how to get in contact with them? Do you have some sort of in to talk to people there? How are you going to reach out to their artistic director? Or how are you going to reach out to their board of directors? It's about putting in the actual research, looking up Black organizations in the Twin Cities, and just doing the simple search to figure out, where can I get this information out to? Because just putting it out to the places that you're putting it out to right now is not doing it. We're not getting the job done. So what can you do now to change that?
Yeah, I think I want to second that with a lot of, there's a particular director, he's white, bless his heart, but he's always emailing and saying, Toussaint, we're trying to reach out to Black directors. We need to, do you know any people other than yourself that can do things? And I'm like, the reason why you're asking me is because this speaks immediately to your circle. You don't have any Black people in your circle, man. So you have to start doing as white people, you have to start doing the work before the audition, before you need the person. So you got to start including Black people in your lives, regardless of the industry. And then once it's there, then you're like, oh, I mean, me doing all this activism and protesting, I can call 36 Black females more than I could have a month ago. Like I know so many now. Whereas before, when I was like making a film, I was like, I don't have any Black females. When really it was like, it's not because I don't have any Black females, it's because I have limited my circle. I've been comfortable in Minnesota with, just going with the flow of whoever I meet and whoever comes out to me. I haven't made the effort to reach out to Black females. And so now that I have, okay, now you're seeing your circle grow. So once you do the actual personal work, then you'll be able to immediately include BIPOC into your projects.
Very good. All right. Well, we are at the hour, and I really do appreciate all the great questions that came through. And thank you so much to Joetta and Toussaint for giving your time this evening to talk about this topic, because again, it is very important, and it's something that I know as a community, especially as part of WIFT, that we're trying to do better at. So if there's any other questions that folks had, send an email to communications@minwift.org, and we can certainly start at least continue that conversation there. In the next couple of weeks, WIFT is planning on unveiling an online community where we're hoping to continue to have a lot of these conversations. So hopefully we can, again, not let this stop and have it be something that we're always constantly talking about. So you're welcome to send an email to, again, it's communications@minwift.org. The recording for the session will be out in a couple of days. We'll have it on our YouTube channel. But again, we thank you all for your time and really appreciate you joining. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you, WIFT.
Thank you so much, Alison.
Right.
Have a good one.
Yep.